10 years is a long time. In the last 10 years alone, we've had 3 presidents, 10 new mainline Call of Duty games, 7 new Assassin's Creed games, and 1 announcement for Metroid Prime 4. Hell, in that time, I went from a little snot-nosed 9-year-old to a snot-nosed graduate with a high school diploma and an associate's degree. But no matter what changes around me and around the world, one constant in my life has always been Destiny. It's always been a rocky franchise, to say the least, from mishandled DLC to blatantly misunderstanding their own vision for the series. It's a franchise held together by a pile of string and tape, yet it's one that means the world to me. I can put it down, but I always find myself crawling back, and it's always infatuated me in different ways. When I was younger, it was just the general gameplay and playing with my friends, but as I got older and drifted away from those friends, it was the art direction, the music, and the stories that kept me going. It was a deliberate yet subconscious choice to have Destiny be this anchor in my life. It was a way to give myself control of my life during my developmental years, and I feel like that's something that can't be understated. Destiny as a series being this control point in my life means that the final shape, the newest expansion, and the end to this 10-year light versus dark saga had a lot resting on its shoulders. It had to be a fitting payoff for the last 10 years. That's 12 expansions across 2 games. The only reason I say payoff and not conclusion is because in a game like Destiny, there really isn't an end, per se. The credits can roll, but there's always more story, whether it be in seasonal content or post-campaign quests. What makes talking about the game difficult is the fact that it's a never-ending hamster wheel of gameplay. And that gameplay loop is subject to critique. However, it's also subject to change, so talking about it is an easy way to make the video dated. But the thing about talking about the story is that it's typically set in stone. Another reason I don't talk about Destiny on the channel, despite my love for it, is alongside the never-ending gameplay loop, Bungie has always been very iffy when it comes to releasing expansions across the series. Sometimes it can be really good and enthrall players for a whole year, or they can deliver something very lackluster that brings down morale across the board. So community morale is also a huge factor when it comes to talking about these games. However, I believe that the final shape is some of Destiny's best content and a fitting payoff for the last 10 years. So today, I want to go over why this expansion works so well thematically, and I want to use it to reflect on my tenure with the franchise. Don't consider this a comprehensive review of the final shape. My goal isn't to tell you if this is worth your time and money, since that can be summed up quite easily. Should you buy the final shape if you like Destiny or want a conclusion? Yes, it wraps up 10 years pretty nice, and the additions to gameplay and quality of life is great. But will this expansion be a game changer for you? Probably not. If you already don't like Destiny, this isn't gonna be for you. It's not gonna change your opinion on the series. At its core, it's still the same game. This is for those who have stuck around with the series and want something to show for it. But the purpose of this video isn't to sell you on the final shape. It's to reflect after playing the final shape. This is still going to be my analysis of the story, so that's your spoiler warning, but I also want to reflect, and I feel like that's the real purpose of the video in my eyes. But with that out of the way, let's begin. First, I want to discuss the elephant in the room. If you've been a fan of almost any active franchise in the last few years, you may have noticed that more and more nostalgia is being used as a device in an attempt to make customers return. This is by no means a new thing. It's one of the most common forms of finding a market. Remember this thing you loved when you were a kid? But now I feel like it's being pushed a lot more. The 34th Marvel movie is banking on the nostalgia an audience has for 2 characters that weren't even in the MCU. We're on the 6th Modern Warfare game, and the second one, called Modern Warfare 3. Indiana Jones 5 just came out after it was thought that the series was done back in 2008. But maybe I'm just in that target demographic now to where people want to pander towards my nostalgia. I don't know. But all I know is that after 6 years of being dead, Cade 6 has returned to Destiny 2 with the final shape. He was all over the marketing, and for the longest time I wondered if it would even be worth it, trying to drag Cade out of his grave, the same grave that Bungie dug from all those years ago in order to get people back into Destiny after the release of Launch Destiny 2 and Curse of Osiris. It was a burning question in my head. Was it worth it? I spent the entire pre-release hype cycle just questioning if bringing back Cade and using all this nostalgia would be worth it. How would it make a story worth telling? I felt as though it would just be nostalgia for the sake of it, but once I actually played the expansion, I was surprised at what we got. It wasn't just the game pointing at things you recognize saying, hey look, you recognize that. It was the game twisting it into this strange familiarity, but not exactly nostalgia bait. It was more like nothing ever happened. It's like this was all planned out from the start. Despite the inconsistent nature of storytelling within the franchise, the stories have been some of my favorite aspects of the franchise in recent memory. Getting lost in the world of Destiny is a feeling that I find to be unmatched. It's one of the few games where I've read the stupid bonus lore cards. The stories have this personal feeling to them that not many other games replicate. You can tell that despite the game being built on tape and string, the world and lore is some of the best stuff on the market, which makes the fact that at its core it's a basic good versus evil story all the more impressive. If I were to draw upon a comparison, I feel as though the Star Wars films are a good example, because these basic stories of good and evil still allow for discussions of nuance between the characters. Within the original trilogy, there are good guys and bad guys, but the characters still have depth. Luke's arc within the original films is him learning how to truly be a hero since people on both sides are trying to manipulate him. While in this journey, we see him go from a whiny brat to this wise monk-like character. Similarly, we see Han also has self-conflict because now he finally has people that care about him besides Chewbacca, and he has to learn to come to terms with that. And we also see Vader's redemption arc. These are all reiterations of classic character arcs that still fit within the binary of good and evil that the series has shifted away from in recent memory in order to try and fit with the newer, more morally ambiguous characters from contemporary shows and movies. I truly do mean this as a modern thing for Star Wars, because even with the prequels, we still saw the idea of good and evil being explored, but with some added depth. Granted, the prequels did a lot wrong, but the core aspect of it being a story of good versus evil is still present, and it's just flipped on its head. Where Luke resisted temptation and became a stronger person in the end, we see Anakin fall to temptation because he didn't have the good influences of Luke. The Jedi of his time were arrogant, so he was easily seduced by evil. However, after the prequels came out, the series tried more and more to separate itself from the basic good versus evil story it was known for, with a lot of the extended universe introducing stuff like Grey Jedi that try to be more morally ambiguous and mature. For those unaware, Grey Jedi are morally ambiguous, in big air quotes, Force users that have access to light and dark, yet apparently aren't drawn to either side, which I think is the lamest thing to be in mainstream Star Wars, because it acts like it's breaking the good and evil binary, when in reality it's just giving evil another label. Not being drawn towards the light makes you just another Sith. It makes you a user of the dark side, and while you may not be as evil as the guys who want to rule the galaxy, you are still fundamentally using evil powers, and the only way to do that is to give way to the dark side and to give way to temptation. And since being a Grey Jedi is essentially just being a centrist, it's out of pure selfishness, and that places you on the dark side. Like I said, it doesn't break the binary. You're just on the evil side, but you're not as comically evil as the mustache-twirling bad guys that some of the Sith are. Because there was years of content about the morally ambiguous characters in the form of comics, books, and fan fictions, it really left a stain on the series for a lot of people, since they now viewed the aspect of good versus evil as childish, which I feel like deviates from the fact that, in the words of George Lucas himself, Star Wars is a series for 12-year-olds. This doesn't mean that they're not allowed to do more mature stories. It doesn't even mean that you're not allowed to enjoy it as an adult. I interpret the statement as him saying, Star Wars is about this core fantasy of good versus evil, and that should be center stage because at the end of the day, a 12-year-old should be able to understand it. Granted, good old Georgie boy didn't really follow that advice when making the prequels, and that's why they were a mess, but that's besides the point. It's why I feel like a partial reason to why the sequels were a mess was because they had to be safe. They had to nuke all this extended universe content because they didn't know what to do with it, what rules to follow. The reason The Force Awakens was so safe was to get people back in this sense of familiarity with the franchise, since so much had changed outside of the movies. But this just got people mad at how safe the movie was. So, in an attempt to course correct, they made The Last Jedi, which wanted to deconstruct the Jedi myth and use it to tell a compelling good versus evil story, but with the goalpost of good and evil essentially moved, since it questions what is good and what is evil, much like the prequels. But many people hated that one. Some for valid reasons, others because it made Star Wars woke or some shit. But in an attempt to course correct again, they made The Rise of Skywalker, and we all know who that one turned out. The reason for my initial comparison and following tangent was to show how easy it is to try and break the binary and have it negatively affect the future of stories within that series. Not that it inherently makes it a bad thing when that binary is broken. The final shape kinda does that. But when the binary is broken, it makes telling stories in a universe with good and evil significantly harder. And that's why I appreciate Destiny, specifically the final shape. It upholds that binary despite the characters having this world-ending threat at their feet. The binary of light and dark is broken, but as the Guardian takes on Prismatic, combining both, it simply shifts the binary to a more traditional good versus evil. These guys are the good guys, and these guys want to kill the good guys, so they're the bad guys. The light and dark is still present, but they aren't as focal anymore. The good versus evil binary, in my opinion, is the glue that holds this franchise's story together, because it allows for stuff like the final shape to have a simple story that focuses on characters. The glue is what makes the final shape story one worth telling. It's a story about grief, mortality, and fate, and how it fits into that good versus evil binary. It's the backdrop. And so it's important that the beacon of good and evil still remains, so it's a guiding light, in a literal and metaphorical sense. On the surface, the final shape is just about killing the witness and stopping his plan to make the dreaded final shape, right? But if we examine the story just a little further, you can see that this expansion is about characters. We see Zavala finally having everything catch up with him, and his survivor's guilt turning him into a reckless man that doesn't even resemble the calm and collected commander that we've known for 10 years. Ikora battles with Zavala because she knows that this isn't the commander, and we see her trying to remind him of who she is. And we see Cade return to be a mentor and a moral compass, which is almost fitting for him, since those aspects were always present under his I don't care demeanor he presented throughout the story. But his story is also one of self-discovery and making your own fate. Throughout the story, bit by bit, we learn that Cade hasn't exactly returned on what many would consider normal terms. He doesn't have his ghost Sundance, he doesn't have access to his light, rather, he's made entirely of light, yet it's still Cade. It isn't until a few missions into the story that we learn that Crow used Ahamkara wish magic in the previous season to open a portal into the Traveler's Pale Heart. When he did that, we also learned that he brought Cade back into existence because he was scared of the future and he needed advice. He wished he hadn't shot Cade as Aldrin. If it's not obvious at this point, I loved Cade in this expansion. He's here for a reason that even he doesn't know, and Nathan Fillion delivers it perfectly. There's one moment at the end of the story that I'll get into later that perfectly encapsulates this. Cade's relaxed yet confused manner is directly opposed to Zavala throughout the story. As I mentioned earlier, Zavala spends a majority of the expansion's runtime directly battling his inner demons, in the form of survivor's guilt. Whether it be reliving the death of his wife and son, or the death of Cade Six, all throughout the campaign we see Zavala shut himself out from his friends and become dangerous to himself through his recklessness. At one point, before you find Zavala, Cade and Ikora are talking to one another, and he asks if Zavala said anything at his eulogy, and Ikora tells him that Zavala didn't even show up. He locked himself in his office for days, and Cade only responds with, "Sometimes grief is just a locked door." When we find Zavala, he's just sitting in his old home with a version of his wife created by the witness, and when Ikora tells him that it's not real and that the darkness is just showing him what he wants to see, Zavala questions what has the Traveler given him. His entire perspective isn't one entirely of greed or self-interest, because over the last 10 years we've learned that Zavala isn't like that. He's selfless. Rather, it's a moment of weakness for the character. For hundreds of years, Zavala has been able to come back over and over and over again, yet the people he loves are constantly taken from him over and over and over again. A combination of this grief and the darkness drives him to act out of character. This isn't Zavala. It's a man on his breaking point after years. He becomes increasingly hostile to Ikora, and he becomes more and more reckless in his actions, which results in his ghost, Tarv, dying when Zavala confronts the witness in an attempt to get any sort of answer. Yet again, Zavala has to sit and watch as someone he loves is taken away from him, and he's powerless to do anything against it, this time in a literal sense. Grief is central to the human experience, and that's what makes it so hard to tackle, because not only does everyone grieve differently, it beckons the question of how should one resolve this issue, because anyone who has ever grieved knows that it doesn't really go away. So how do you represent that in a character's arc? Here, it's wrapped up in Zavala learning how to use stasis, something that he was originally so against the Guardian doing. While everything may still bear a load on his soul, physically he manifests it into learning how to use the darkness, both in a literal and metaphorical sense. It comes back to the thing I said earlier. The stories in Destiny feel personal. Anyone who's ever grieved knows that it doesn't just go away. You can't manifest it into darkness. You can try, but it's always lingering, and I like that the game represents that. No matter what Zavala does, he will never have his light back. It's gone. His grieving process made him lose his light, and he has to live with that, because grieving hurts people. Not just the person grieving, but the people around them, and I like that the game shows that off. But let's change tracks real quick. Let's talk about the witness, since we don't know who the witness is, or what the final shape is. And for the longest time, we really didn't know who the witness was. We didn't even know of the witness until the end of The Witch Queen, where we saw it for the first time. During that cutscene, it was immediately clear that this would be the big bad of the Light versus Dark saga, and throughout the runtime of the final shape, I was constantly thinking to myself that the witness is very much like Thanos from the MCU. In more ways than just being the big bad. The way the witness speaks, the way the witness acts, and the way the witness is generally presented just reminds me of how Thanos was treated in the MCU, and their goals are somewhat similar. As we all know, Thanos wanted to bring balance to the universe by eliminating half the population, and the witness has kind of a similar goal. Before this point, all we knew was that the witness wanted to create the final shape, and for the longest time, we had no clue what that meant. Somewhat like how the concept of the Infinity Stones were introduced in Guardians of the Galaxy but weren't utilized until Infinity War. But unlike the stones, the final shape is a potential end state for the universe in which the witness plans to carve the universe into a frozen state of eternal perfection. In this hypothetical state of reality, only items and entities with a purpose or structure that the witness deemed fit for existence will remain. What makes the witness work so well as an antagonist is the fact that it works as this ultimate evil in the way few villains have been before. Historically, Destiny villains have been just villains, simply because they're enemies of the light, which works, I guess, but the best antagonists were always the ones that actually felt like a threat. Uldren Sov was great because he killed Cayde right in front of us, and he was a character previously established in Destiny 1. He was more than just an enemy of the light, he was an enemy to us. Oryx was similar, but he was mad at us because we killed his son Crota, so he unleashed his Taken army on us, which was unlike anything we'd seen before. Savathun had even more because she was directly related to both Oryx and Crota, and she found a way to manifest the light in order to give the Hive use. But for every good villain, there were underdeveloped villains that were only there for flavor of the week. Villains like Panoptes, Aramis, Dominus Gaul, Skolas, and Zol. Villains that only existed because we needed something to kill. They would barely interact with us throughout the campaign until it was time to kill them. They had no motivation or external driving factor aside from wanting to take over the light or something. The Witness, on the other hand, feels like a great threat, not just against the light, but the universe in general. The Witness doesn't just want to take over the light or the universe, it wants to freeze everything, make a perfect universe. As Marasov states at the start of the campaign, this is a battle for the fate of all things. It's a stupid, cheap, and easy way to build tension, but it works because it's convincing enough. I mean, who doesn't care about the fate of all things? This building antagonist wants to get rid of everything? Sure, let's kick his ass. That, in combination with the more mental-focused attacks he does at the Vanguard and the Guardian throughout the campaign, is more than enough to make him work as an antagonist, especially because the focal point is on the characters in this expansion. We didn't need the Witness constantly breathing down our air, we had the character drama to fill that out, but the final shape does both, and it does it pretty well. The Witness also works because the game shows us, through gameplay, that this is one hard motherfucker to kill. We confronted at the end of the campaign and only heard it a little bit. We only further heard it during the raid by severing its connection to the Traveler and its light. It only takes an assault on the Witness's complex after the raid to kill it. The build-up to this mission was insane because we had to wait until after the world's first raid completion, and we didn't even know what the mission would be until it came out. And it didn't help that this just became the longest world's first race in franchise history, but even then, it was worth it because this isn't just a 3-man or a 6-man mission. No. This is the first 12-man activity in Destiny, and it's a momentous occasion. This is the Avengers Assemble moment from Endgame. Every single ally that we've made throughout the history of the series, except for Shahan, is assembled and storms the Witness's complex. It takes the combined power of 12 Guardians using their ghosts to harness a beam of the Traveler's light to kill it, and it's a fitting end, and honestly, it's all that I can ask for. A fitting end to the first saga in Destiny 2, and it goes out with a bang. After the final mission is completed, a couple of cutscenes play out, with the first one being about Cayde 6. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that this is also an expansion about mortality and fate, and here is the perfect encapsulation of that idea. After harnessing the power of the Traveler through our ghost, the ghost essentially dies. But then, we see Cayde, who comes and talks to us for a bit, and he decides that he wants to give his light for our ghost, which would make him one with the light again. If you remember, Cayde is entirely made up of light now. He's nothing but a figment of the Traveler. So, him giving his light is essentially dying. But it's what he says that's the most important aspect of the scene, in my opinion, since it directly correlates with an event earlier in the story. At one point earlier in the story, when looking for some uncorrupted light, Cayde is presented with a vision. It's the Traveler pretending to be Sundance, and yet again, it's being cryptic. Earlier in the story, when looking for some uncorrupted light, Cayde is presented with a vision. It's the Traveler pretending to be his ghost Sundance, and yet again, being cryptic. After talking with Sundance for a bit, Cayde asks, "What if what I want to do is stay here with you?" And Sundance, or the Traveler, replies, "If that's the fate you make." Cayde didn't understand what Sundance was talking about in the moment, but now he realizes. And with that realization, Cayde tells us, "Make sure you tell the others that this was my choice, my light. Nobody makes my fate but me." It all comes full circle here, and it's Cayde choosing his own fate. And I feel like that's representative of the Traveler as a whole. The reason that it's so cryptic and only gives power without telling you anything is because it wants you to choose your own fate. It's the Traveler letting you forge your own destiny, hence the name of the series. Cayde's send-off is followed up by a celebration scene, where the Vanguard and you sit on the edge of the tower as all the lanterns go up into the sky, and Ikora and Zavala reflect on finally having won, but it doesn't feel any different. Crow then tells them it's because they haven't celebrated yet, so the Vanguard and the Guardians send off their lanterns and decide not to worry about the future until that time comes. After that, we get these beautifully drawn black and white stills of the characters we didn't see and how everyone's reacting to the destruction of the Witness and how they're faring. But after that, it just cuts to this. You and your ghost sitting on the edge of the helm, watching the Traveler. I didn't know what I was expecting, but this feels like a greater conclusion than I could have ever imagined. It's not some big party like at the end of Return of the Jedi. We aren't at a bar getting wasted with the Vanguard. Hell, we aren't even with anyone if you do the mission solo. It's just you and your ghost enamored by the beauty of the Traveler, and I sat there saying to myself, "That's a nice-ass ending," until this text came up. It means, "We thank you" in Latin, and this pushed me over the edge. I just sat there and thought about my life. The people that have come and gone, the memories I've made, and the fact that this series has been in my life for 10 years. And the realization that I was just sitting there at the end. It was hard to believe. Then, after just watching the Traveler for a bit, I went back to Orbit, and this new piano piece played instead of the normal Orbit music, and I fucking lost it, man. It was the same sensation I felt when watching Guardians of the Galaxy 3. It's like every single emotion that I've ever felt when playing Destiny manifested at once in that moment. It wasn't tears of joy, sadness, laughter. It was just tears. It was the weight of the moment coming down on me at that exact moment. While not lasting very long, it still rocked me to my core. That track of music annihilated me beyond belief, and in that moment, I was brought back to the countless nights I spent in orbit or just running around the tower talking to my friends. I was brought back to the countless hours I spent raiding with people I didn't know, only brought together by a sense of camaraderie in order to get the weapons and armor that we wanted. I thought about everything that this game has ever thrown at me, all the error codes, all the ruins attempt at flawless dungeons, all the bad PvP matches, and how I overcame it. It was when I realized why I kept coming back to Destiny. It wasn't for the loot, it wasn't for the grind, it wasn't for the story, it was for all of it. I enjoy each individual aspect. I enjoy the art, the shooting, the loot, the soundtrack, the story, but it all comes together, and being able to see the visions of thousands of people who have worked on this series over the last decade is what I love. I was at peace. If I were to stop playing Destiny right now and never pick it back up, I don't think I'd be missing anything, because that's not what this was about. Funnily enough, it was about forging my own destiny, and despite the issues that I've had with this series over its life, I wouldn't trade any of it for the world. To anyone who's ever been at Bungie, or anyone who I've ever played with, good or bad, I thank you. I thank you for all the times I've laughed, for all the times I've screamed at my screen because of stupid fucking teammates. I thank you just for the memories. And to everyone else who's been watching, I've been Brizu, and thanks. See you in the next one.